In this recording, which by the way is going to be a little longer than the rest, but I beg you to please push through it and listen to everything. This is vital information. I'm going to be dealing with what is known as the Cape Landers. That is you and I. This chapter or this part will deal with where you and I came from, how you and I came into being. This is extremely important for you to understand so that you know why secession is one of. I'm not saying it's the only solution, but to me it is the best. But it is definitely not the only solution. I can think of at least one other solution, but I don't think we are prepared to go there. I don't think enough of us are prepared to go there. So let's talk secession for the moment. I'm not going to keep you up too long with this one, because the information I want to share is extremely important and I don't want to make this recording too long, as I said. So please bear with me, listen through to the end. This is vital information, because in the next chapter or the next chapters we are going to start with the very reasons why we can, why we should, and why we are going to secede the Cape from South Africa. Enjoy. This recording is going to be a little bit or quite a bit longer than the previous two. This is where we start getting into the history and the reasons why things have happened the way they have and why secession has to take place for our own goods. This is going to be Part 1, Chapter 1. Part 1 is called The Cape. Chapter 1 is The Cape and South Africa. The chapter synopsis is: the Cape, situated at the southwestern tip of Africa, is blessed with a history and an old established majority population which is unlike any other to be found elsewhere in Africa, including South Africa, and not just unlike other African communities, but a truly unique one. What makes it unique is the story of how it came about and what the ultimate result was. It was born at the Cape of Good Hope. Its ancestors, an astounding array of individuals hailing from near and far, who were propelled into a veritable melting pot by a variety of circumstances, and in less than 5 centuries became a new people with a distinct new culture, a new language, and a lasting spiritual attachment to its small corner of the vast continent of Africa. Origins of the Cape and its people. A brief overview of the origins of the Cape and its people and how it became part of South Africa is necessary before any discussion about the intention to secede, that is, Cape Exit for short, from the present Republic of South Africa and march into the future as an independent nation. The first inhabitants of the Cape were a very sparse collection of small nomadic hunter-forager family groups who probably called themselves by the clique name of Kung or Kung, if anything. We say if anything because the groups lived independent lives and spoke a variety of dialects, owning nothing and yet everything. They lived for untold centuries in complete harmony with their surroundings, provided with all their simple wants and needs. They knew nothing of the outside world, and it knew nothing of them, because south of the Sahara, Africa would remain a mysterious place till the era of global exploration dawned only a few hundred years ago. But all this was fated to change. Ever since the early centuries of the Christian era, a mass of pastoral black clans, or mini-tribes, now known as Bantu, set out on a slow but remorseless movement southwards from the basins of the Congo and Niger rivers in West Africa, conquering everything and everyone in their way. It was a classic Darwinian process in which might was right and the weaker went to the wall. Conquest usually meant death for the losers, the winners walking away with the spoils: land, livestock, grain, and other food supplies, and sometimes young women for wives. Then, about a millennium ago, while the Bantu were still inching their way down from West Africa, a number of cattle-owning clans from somewhere north of today's Botswana started moving southwards as well, and eventually spread, albeit thinly, to many parts of the later Republic of South Africa, including the later Cape. What they called themselves, if in fact they had an overall name, given that they consisted of fiercely independent clans with no sense of overall nationhood, remains a matter for debate. Among early European visitors, they became generally known as Hottentots, a label of unverified origins. In comparatively modern times, they received a catch-all generic name with various iterations, including Khoi, Khoikhoi, Kukun, and Khoina. The Khoi, to be accurate, being generally mispronounced as Khoi instead of Twe or Kwe. The widely used modern term for both the Khoi and the Kung is Khoisan, a compound term for both which was coined in the 1920s by a German named Leonhard Schultz. It later achieved widespread use on the basis of a hypothesis that both groups were part of the same language family, although there is no anthropological or historical proof of its validity. Nevertheless, Khoisan came into common use after the end of the apartheid era, inter alia as a self-designated identity to distinguish its members from the Bantu tribes after the end of the apartheid era. Whatever the case, the result of the Khoi arrival in the far south was inevitable. The San or Kung had always lived off the land with its bountiful fruits, vegetables, and herds of game rather than cultivating or husbanding livestock. The Khoi also lived off the land, but in addition they were skilled herdsmen, to whom livestock were not just a vital food source, but also the most valuable social possession they possessed. And so there commenced a sporadic but deadly struggle for domination and simple survival that lasted for many lifetimes. By the 17th century, when the systematic, recorded historical record of the Cape of Good Hope begins, the Kung had been decimated, reduced to Khoi serfs, partly absorbed or driven into the most remote areas. The first cracks in the veil of obscurity hiding the Cape from the rest of the world, however, appeared much earlier. By the 15th century, the Portuguese, then the world's most renowned seafarers and traders, had begun searching for a sea route to Asia's riches, and in 1488 the explorer Bartholomew Diaz rounded the Cape after a long and harrowing voyage down Africa's west coast. Diaz failed when some distance up the east coast, he was forced to turn back because his sailors firmly believed that the world was flat and they were about to sail over its edge. But in 1497, another Portuguese seafarer on the same quest, Vasco da Gama, arrived at the Cape and succeeded in reaching Asia. After that, Portuguese ships called in at the Cape from time to time, and in 1510 there was a short but bloody clash with members of the Khoi clan near today's Salt River, in which the outgoing viceroy of the Portuguese possessions in India, Don Francisco Almeida, was killed. This left the Khoi with an undeserved reputation for ferocity, and the Portuguese ships ceased calling at the Cape. By the end of the 16th century, however, Portuguese influence in Asia was waning and the Dutch became dominant in the East Indian trade. The ultimate result was the formation of the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, colloquially abbreviated the VOC or Dutch East India Company, which grew into the largest commercial trading concern the world had ever seen. Even though the Netherlands were still technically, albeit reluctantly, under the suzerainty of the powerful Spanish Empire. By the mid-17th century, the Netherlands was the most prosperous country in Europe and the foremost European naval power despite its tiny size. Its wealth depended in large part on the East India trade, and various VOC and some other ships called at the Cape from time to time on long voyages, taking anything up to 6 months, to and from the Far East. These sporadic contacts with the Cape's inhabitants did not turn into any kind of permanent arrangement till 1648, after the Netherlands had succeeded in wresting its full freedom from the Spanish. Then the VOC received favorable reports about the Cape and its allegedly ferocious but amenable people from a Netherlands-bound ship. Reports by the ship's captain and one of the passengers, a minor official named Jan van Riebeck, persuaded the VOC to establish a replenishment and repair facility at the Cape, a convenient halfway house along the trade route. On the 6th of April of 1652, Jan van Riebeck duly arrived with 3 small ships and a modest contingent of workers, a few soldiers, and a quantity of tools, timber, and trade goods. His task was to set up an outpost at which company ships could be replenished with beef, vegetables, and fresh water, and necessary repairs carried out. The proverbial winds of change now began to blow in earnest over the sparse network of independent semi-nomadic Khoi clans of various sizes. Many attempts have been made to portray Van Riebeck's arrival as the birth date of colonialism in the Cape, but this is incorrect. He was not a conqueror, imperialist, or colonialist, but an official with a strictly limited mandate. The company maintained a variety of remote outposts, some permanent and others temporary, for replenishment, trade, or both, as a private shareholding concern whose purpose was profit rather than seizures of no man's land in the name of some European king or other. The Cape did not become a recognized Dutch possession until 1802. This being the case, the VOC did not believe in wasting money on unnecessary ventures like colonies. Its preferred procedure was to establish a mutually beneficial business relationship with whatever ruler controlled the region where it needed an outpost. True, the Cape had no supreme ruler but had good fresh water for the ship's casks, plenty of fruit and vegetables, and most importantly, a substantial pastoral population from whom cattle were traded, slaughtered and salted down for the VOC ships' long voyages. Van Riebeck had been given strict instructions. Among other things, he was not to establish a colony, try to convert the Khoi to Christianity, or make war on them unless they broke a solemn future treaty or made war on him. They were not oppressed, displaced, or enslaved, and the Khoi were to be left to pursue their traditional semi-nomadic lifestyle in order to ensure a steady supply of livestock. In principle, the VOC disliked slavery, yet it required a labor force. The outpost got off to a rocky start, so much so that the company came close to abandoning its venture in the first few years. But circumstances improved. Van Riebeck established generally cooperative relations with the nearby clans, and the Kaapse Vlak, the Cape Hamlet, began to grow because it soon became clear that the Cape outpost was essential to the company's operations. Few Cape Townians realize today what a seminal role the Cape was to play in the crucially important process of opening up the social, political, and economic exchange between two far distant parts of the world. Needless to say, the Cape Hamlet grew quickly in the years after his arrival and departure. The Netherlands was so prosperous that it had a severe shortage of domestic manpower, especially of the pioneering type. And so the VOC recruited many of its soldiers, sailors, farm laborers, wagon drivers, artisans, fishermen, woodcutters, and other workers from a variety of countries in northwestern Europe, France, the Netherlands, the plethora of small German states, Ireland, Scandinavia, and elsewhere. Typically, the VOC employee would take on a renewable contract of at least 5 years, excluding travel time to and from the Cape. Then and later, many of the contract workers came from the areas where the primary language was the Plattdeutsch, Low German dialect, which was very similar to Dutch. In 1867, too, there arrived a batch of Huguenots, Protestant Frenchmen fleeing from Roman Catholic persecution. Slaves and freeborn craftsmen arrived from Bengal, today's Bangladesh, and other parts of India, and from what is now Indonesia. As well, a small trickle from West Africa and Madagascar. Some new arrivals were seafarers who had stayed on after being shipwrecked along the dangerous and sometimes storm-wrecked Cape Coast. Yet others were people who had either ventured to the Cape for botanical, scientific, or other reasons, or birds of passage who had had enough of voyaging, or foraged the Cape more than their intended destinations and had decided to remain in the Cape. There was even a small batch of exiled Chinese convicts who stayed on after expiration of their terms of imprisonment and were quickly immersed in the Cape's expanding cosmopolitan melting pot. The incomers and the remnants of the Khoi clans were all absorbed into the broad Dutch culture of the VOC, and their offspring knew no other home than the Cape. Many Khoi too had abandoned their traditional clan existence and entered the VOC's service or found private employment, first as herdsmen and later also as farm or other laborers, particularly after a devastating epidemic of dreaded smallpox broke out in February 1713. On the 13th of that month, a VOC ship made landfall at the Cape with members of its crew suffering from smallpox, which had broken out after its departure from the East Indies. The VOC had a strict inspection procedure in place to guard against such an eventuality, but for reasons now lost in the mists of time, it apparently malfunctioned, and their infected clothing and other linen were sent ashore to be laundered at the VOC slave lodge. The epidemic struck immediately and spread like wildfire, killing people from all walks of life with ferocious impartiality. Within weeks, 8 out of every 10 slaves who had been exposed to it were dying. The worst hit, though, was the Khoi, who had absolutely no resistance to the disease. Many of the locally resident Khoi fled inland and carried the sickness with them to their home clans, where it wreaked further havoc. By the time the epidemic subsided a year later, a quarter of the outpost's population had succumbed, and the broader traditional Khoi community was just about decimated. Survivors reported that in southern and western areas there had been a mortality rate of at least 90%. In some cases, entire clans had been wiped out almost to a man. leaving so few members still alive that they could not be re-established. As if this was not devastating enough, several years of drought and livestock disease followed, further impoverishing most of those still left. The Khoi clan structure had been in decline for years before 1713 as a result of the innovations introduced by the more advanced VOC society, and the epidemic was, to all intents and purposes, a mortal blow. All the more so because people who contracted smallpox but survived were rendered sterile. The final coup de grace only came in 1755, however, when a second epidemic in 1755 struck amid an ever-increasing expansion of the Cape by white and brown frontiersmen and nomadic track boers. Long before then, the Cape people had already sunk their roots into Cape soil as the incomers and many remnants of the vanished Khoi clans were absorbed into the broad Dutch culture of the VOC. They and their offspring knew and wanted to know no other homeland than the Cape. What it amounted to was that the Cape was now well on the way to becoming a colony, but by a process that had been dictated by changing circumstances and or unforeseen events rather than deliberate design. By strict definition, colonization means the deliberate population of territory by people from elsewhere, usually to achieve a political aim. The Cape outpost did not conform to this pattern. It had started as a possible temporary commercial outpost to enhance the efficiency of ships on the sea route to and from the Far East. Because of its strategic location and several unforeseen and unforeseeable circumstances, it had grown to a far larger and, more importantly, a long-term enterprise. There was no doubt that the Cape was far too important for the VOC's operations to be relinquished. The 1713 epidemic and its after effects had been a major milestone in the Cape's history, but not its first. The movement towards a full-fledged permanent settlement had started, albeit unwittingly, within a few years of Van Riebeck's arrival. The Cape could satisfy almost all of the company's requirements except wheat, an essential element because of the need for vast quantities of the ship's biscuit, a flinty but essential part of the seafaring diet. But it was unknown at the Cape, and Van Riebeck's solution was to create a new category of employees, the free burghers, company employees who had been released from their contracts to grow wheat and other crops. It was a significant moment. Cattle trading could be seen as something transient, easy to start and stop if the circumstances required it. Tilling the land, however, was intrinsically a more permanent process. This is not to say that the acquisition of slaughter stock had lost importance. The VOC had its own small breeding herd, but it was far from able to support the ship's demand, and the main source of livestock remained the Khoi. A new class of pastorals had also appeared, men of all kinds who roamed the outer fringes of the VOC jurisdiction. Theoretically, all the animals had to be sold to the company, but this was widely winked at by the trakboere, as they were later to be called. Another milestone was passed before long when the construction of the Castle of Good Hope began in 1666 to replace Van Riebeck's original earth-walled fort in 1652, which was now in an abandoned state of dilapidation. Since the VOC kept tight control of its purse strings at all times, completion of the stone-built castle in 1679 was an early indication of the Cape's growing importance to the company. It was a massive construction for that time and place. The awestruck Khoi, who had never seen anything like it in their lives, called it Khoikip, the stone kraal. All its guns pointed seawards. It was there not to ward off the Khoi, but to ensure that none of the other trading companies hijacked the outpost, which happened occasionally. But it was still not a colony of the normal type. The first deliberately planned colonization did not start in southern Africa until the 1820 settlers were brought out by the British government, not for commercial reasons, but as a deliberate action to form a human shield against the Xhosa along the troublesome part of the eastern colonial border. This was to anticipate what followed. By the early 18th century, therefore, little more than 6 or 7 decades after Van Riebeck's arrival, the new community had taken shape and had even started speaking a lingua franca, which had arisen as a result of the incomers' struggle to master the classical High Dutch, which was the Cape's official language. This embryonic language was still clearly descended from High Dutch, but it was far from being a clone. Over time, it became studded with loan words from French, German, Khoi, Malay, and other languages. Many came from the east, like pisang and blatjang, for example, or from the Khoi dialects, Abba, Eina, Hogs, and Karos. Its grammar, too, took a form of its own. Its practitioners habitually used the typical Malay double negative, something unknown in High Dutch, and, for example, the repetition of words for adding emphasis, such as gou gou, which means quick quick, emerged. For years, speakers of High Dutch sneered at it as a mere pigeon tongue, but in time it came to be informally used at most levels of Cape society. Its evolution was not a formal or ordered process. It grew by itself as the years went by, with all Capelanders sporadically contributing words, phrases, and other usages. As far as is known, it was referred to as die taal, but much later it would morph into a language we know today as Afrikaans. In addition, the early 18th century saw the emergence of the term Afrikaner, meaning a person of any ethno-cultural group who had been born at the Cape, coming at a time when indigenous tribes still identified themselves only by group names. It was a significant indication of the Cape society to their new African homeland. None of this bothered the Dutch East India Company, whose concerns were focused not on founding a nation, but on a bottom line written in black instead of red ink. In practice, the Cape was essentially a non-racial society at almost all levels, and would remain so for the 140-odd years of VOC rule. Governor Simon van der Stel, for example, was known to be of part Indian origin, and promotion to officer's rank in the part-time Citizens Defence Force. The Burger militia was not subject to racial restrictions. According to the renowned researcher Dr. Hans Hees, or Hees, colour discrimination at the Cape did not get underway until the British arrived after this first invasion in 1795. It seems clear that the Cape society, apart from the usual social divisions found in every country, the barriers were ones of class rather than race, with free people on one side and slaves on the other, although Cape slaves were evidently rather better treated on the whole than in many other slave-owning societies. Jan van Riebeck set the example by taking the Khoi girl Kratoa into his household, where she was baptized as Eva, and later married the Danish surgeon Pieter van Meerhof. Their direct descendants include such prominent figures of later years as President Paul Kruger, iconic voortrekker and Boer hero, South Africa's only international statesman Field Marshal Jan Smuts, and President F.W. de Klerk. The result of all the social interaction was that by the mid-1700s there was an inextricable racial and cultural intermingling taking place. The VOC addressed the perennial scarcity of European wives for its employees by facilitating marriages between them and women of color, whether local freeborn or manumitted slaves, in the belief that this contributed to a more stable labor force. At the same time, to the rigidly respectable VOC administration's disapproval, Cape Town's slave lodge also served as an unauthorized bordello, which did a roaring trade whenever a squadron of ships arrived and spent a few days loading or unloading cargo, undergoing repairs or revictualling. Since there were no contraceptive devices in those days, the results can be imagined. The extent of the resultant intermingling probably would be impossible to chart in detail today, but generally believed to have been a common occurrence. The only way to do so would likely be using a mass DNA analysis of the gene pool of the old established Cape's modern descendants. Nevertheless, from all indications, it is clear that the process of intermingling was more extensive than is generally believed. This is not to say that the old Cape was a proverbial land of milk and honey, by any means. There was not much of a social parachute in those days, so poor people tended to remain poor, just as they did in most countries around the world, and still do, but it was a land of opportunity. A poor man with enough intelligence, energy, and a little luck could achieve reasonable prosperity, even if he started as an illiterate Dutch sailor or a former slave who had been manumitted by his owner or had painstakingly saved enough money to buy himself out. One former slave from West Africa, Evert van Guinea, is known to have prospered to such an extent that by the time he died early in the 18th century, he owned a farm in the Stellenbosch area. In a nutshell, The new entity, which was emerging in the early 18th century, was a veritable Cape nation of many varieties, which exposed the ANC government's current race classification system for the blatantly political sham that it is. This presents an interesting paradigm. Liberals proclaim that diversity is always a good thing. It can be, sometimes, usually when the various elements have some degree of common broad social background, an example being the way the United States swallowed and more or less successfully digested an enormous flood of European immigrants in the 19th century. This included the members of the old established African American community, socially handicapped though they were for so many years into the future. In recent times, however, there has also been a strong revival of the concept of the ethnically homogeneous or neo-so nation-state. One recent example is the former Soviet Union, many of whose essentially captive republics bided their time until Moscow was at its weakest and unable to intervene, and then simply declared independence. The same happened in Yugoslavia, where the demise of European communism resulted, however, after much bloody warfare in this case, in the birth of some small nation-states where the vast majority of each shared ethnological and religious background. A wise man whose name is unknown once declared that there were two types of nation: the melting pot, where newcomers of desperate origins were absorbed and turned into loyal citizens of the host country, and the fruit salad, whose ingredients remained basically unchanged and sporadically clashed with one another. A current example being the native Ukrainians and the descendants of the ethnic Russians transplanted there by Joseph Stalin in the 1930s. And so the question is, where do the members of the many-hued Cape Nation fit into this spectrum? The answer is a simpler one than might be imagined. They are cemented together by three powerful factors which transcend mere politically imposed barriers. Firstly, an undeniable common heritage and ethnicity, so that skin color, names, or social standing are largely irrelevant as markers of anything in real terms. Secondly, a general acceptance of similar social values. It is now mostly forgotten that during a brief rule, which was 1803 to 1806, of the Batavian Republic, Cape people were governed by one of the first written constitutions in the world. It was a remarkably liberal democratic one for those intolerant times, in which the alleged divine right of kings was still a widely accepted doctrine. Inter alia, it required the immediate abolition of slavery, equal status for all recognized religions, including Islam, no arrests or house searches without a court warrant, and the eventual establishment of a non-racial qualified franchise. Most of this was when the second British invasion of 1806 turned the Cape into an ordinary crown colony, directly and often autocratically ruled by a governor from London. However, the democratic footprint of the Batavian Republic, with its emphasis on civil rights, freedom of worship, and personal liberty, had been trodden so deeply into the soil of the Cape that it did not die out, but continued to exercise an influence on South African political thought that later was frequently ignored but never extinguished. Thirdly, a common language, today's Afrikaans, which is spoken as a primary tongue by a very large majority of so-called whites and coloureds in the Western Cape Province, as well as a large part of the Northern Cape Province and a substantial western part of the Eastern Cape Province. It is also the first language of a surprising number of people of other ethnic groups, including hundreds of thousands of blacks in the northern provinces. This fact alone is a powerful driver for secession. Afrikaans is now a sophisticated, internationally recognized modern language, complete with extensive technical and scientific vocabularies and a considerable body of literature. Except for English, Afrikaans is the only fully developed minority South African language at this level of development. This should be a matter of national pride, yet the ANC government appears to be hell-bent on reducing it once more to a mere dialect in what amounts to a campaign of cultural genocide, displaying disregard for the damage it would do and is already doing to the lives of millions of innocents, particularly children. It would be fair to suggest that the long-term future of Afrikaans as a full-fledged language in its own right can only be guaranteed by an independent Western Cape, where it would be cherished and fostered rather than imperiled. It is worth noting that an earlier attempt at such cultural destruction by the British conquerors, Anglicisation policy after 1806 failed when elements of the Cape population successfully resisted it. It would be fair also to note, however, that in the long run this failed cultural assault benefited the Cape. English gained a foothold as the second most spoken primary language in the Western Cape, thereby providing Capelanders with a ready-made window on the outer world without detriment to the main indigenous language. As a result, the Western Cape inhabitants have the highest rate of bilingual fluency, as opposed to possession of a mere smattering of a second language, of any South African provinces, the product of a natural cultural evolution rather than an imposed social engineering process. The influence of the Cape nation began to spread in earnest during the 18th century. Capelanders had long been irked by the heavy hand of the VOC. It dictated to the freeburgers what crops they should grow and at what prices their produce should be sold, controlled immigration and monopolized all trade. Many disgruntled farmers and pastoralists responded by moving even further inland to get out from under the heavy hand of the VOC bureaucracy. The VOC administration did what it could to control these migrants, such as establishing a new magistracy at Swellendam in 1745 and another at Graafrenet in 1786, and declaring the Gamtoos River as the farthest eastern frontier of the Cape. None of these measures worked because the trackboers simply ignored them almost completely. In 1780, the Great Fish River was declared the official boundary, and this worked well because the eastern side was already populated by the Xhosa nation, the vanguard of the protracted Bantu southernmost advance. In 1795, the British occupied the Cape and managed it like a crown colony, but this was merely a temporary occupation occasioned by the wars with France. In terms of the ill-fated 1802 Peace of Amiens, the Cape was handed back to the Dutch control in the shape of the Batavian Republic, because the VOC had disappeared from the scene. But the Amiens Treaty was doomed to failure, and in 1806 the British invaded again, this time to stay. After a short but fierce battle at Blouberg, 25 kilometers from Cape Town, the Cape became a British crown colony once again. In 1814, an exhausted and financially devastated Batavian Republic was forced to cede control to the British in terms of the Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1814. The Battle of Blouberg was yet another milestone in the story of the Cape. It was the first concrete manifestation, and the last for a very long time, of the Cape Nation. The vastly outnumbered Batavian line included 3 units of Cape men, fighting side by side. The Swellendam Dragoons, mounted infantry, composed of nominally white men, the Hottentot light infantry of coloured men and some Khoi, and the Javanche Artillery Corps, manned by Cape Malay light artillerymen. All had sworn an oath of loyalty to the Batavian Republic. The Malays, in the name of Allah, a most unusual phenomenon in those days. All were volunteers of some sort. The Dragoons and Malays were part-time members of the Burger Militia, and the HLI was a full-time regular regiment. They stood fast when some other Batavian units started to crumble, and fought till they were ordered to retreat, which they did in good order when it was clear that they could not hold against the 2-to-1 odds. Thanks partly to their dogged resistance, however, General Jan Willem Janssens could keep his forces intact and use them later to extract favorable terms of capitulation which benefited the Cape population. One might ask, what made them fight so hard against the battle-hardened British infantry, then some of the best fighting men in the world? The answer is equally simple. One can train soldiers as much as one likes, but if lacking in spirit, they will not do well in battle. The Cape men who fought at Blouberg had 2 things in common that bound them together. All of them spoke what was not yet Afrikaans, and all were born and bred members of the Cape Nation. We happy few, William Shakespeare wrote about the soldiers at the Battle of Agincourt in the 13th century. For he that bleeds with me today shall be my brother. It is a sad and tragic thing that in later years Capelanders swiftly forgot about the sacrifice of the Cape Nation's own band of brothers. The Cape Colony remained part of the British Empire, eventually becoming part of the Union of South Africa on the 31st of May 1912. It was an unwieldy and foredoomed conglomeration of crown colonies, defeated Boer republics, and stringently controlled black tribes. all lumped together into a rigid, unitary state whose inhabitants could not possibly become a true nation in their hearts of hearts, and never did. After the 1994 elections, the Cape Province, as it was known at the time, was split up by the ANC into three new provinces: Western Cape, Eastern Cape, and Northern Cape.